My name's Stephen Phillips. I'm the director of the Cal Poly Los Angeles Metropolitan Program in Architecture and Urban Design. We're going to start with our lecture in a moment with Lydia. I'm going to say Kallipoliti.
Kallipoliti.
Yeah?
You are Greek, but you don't know it.
Anyway, all good. And first I though want to introduce Angela Anthony. Angela Anthony she manages the events coordination for Helms Bakery District and the Helms Design Center, and she's one of our important and very gracious hosts for our lecture series, which now that we are online and remote, it's a bit different. But Angela, go for it.
Yeah, it's a bummer we don't have our big reception with all that delicious food and, stuff, but it's just as good. Hi, everyone. I just want to welcome you tonight and thank you for joining us. And Lydia, Stephen and I have been working together for a number of years now. It's been a lot of fun. And for those of you who have not been at Helms Bakery, it was an actual working bakery at the time, and it's turned into an opportunity for us to host events like this, all art, architecture, and design events. And I'm bummed that I don't get to know this class because it was really fun the first few that we had together. So I'm going to welcome you, Lydia. Thank you for joining us and being here. And I'm going to turn it back over to Stephen and we'll start the evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ευχαριστώ, Lydia.
Oh my God. That's beautiful.
I am Greek.
All right. So back to me. So all of you, thank you for joining us. We're running a lecture series here through Cal Poly Los Angeles Metro Program. We're part of San Luis Obispo's Cal Poly campus. We are a satellite part of the program. We're off campus here in Los Angeles, and we have about 31 students in our gallery who are all in our exhibition space here by Lydia, which is fantastic. And just, in general, we run this program here in LA. It's from January to June. It's about 30 students here. They intern in offices. They have studio design. We're in the middle of mid-reviews right now as well. And they have history theory classes. We have about 5 other faculty who are all fantastic. Some may or may not be joining us this evening. And I don't know what else I want to say. We have some fantastic sponsors as well, which maybe I'll just mention ever so briefly. They sponsor our fellowships, our scholarships, and our events. Of course, Helms Bakery District, HMC Architects, Morphosis Architects, AC Martin, Co-Architects, Theater DNA, Bulltaup, Arc Document Solutions, and our media sponsors, LAAIA, ArcConnect, and KCRW DNA. So without spending too much time, I just want to briefly introduce our speaker, Lydia Kallipoliti. She's fantastic. We only just really met, even though we're sort of both Princetonians in our background, but at the Divergence Symposium Conference for PhD students just a few weeks ago in March, right before everything got shut down. So I'm happy we had that opportunity to meet. We're both divergent characters and proud of it. And and it was a great event put on by Georgia Tech. Anyway, so she's going to be speaking, and of course her topic is completely on target tonight. The title is The Paradox of Containment and the Architecture of Closed Worlds. Lydia Kallipoliti is an architect, an engineer, and scholar whose research focuses on the intersections of architecture, technology, and environmental politics. She's an assistant professor of architecture at the Cooper Union in New York. Prior to Cooper Union, she was an assistant professor at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where she directed the MSArch program, and also at Syracuse University prior to that. She also taught at Columbia University and Pratt Institute. Kallipoliti is the author of the book, The Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit? Lars Mueller's book, published in 2018, as well as the History of Ecological Design for Oxford English Encyclopedia of Environmental Science. Her work has been exhibited in a number of international venues, including the Venice Biennale, the Istanbul Design Biennale, the Shenzhen Biennale, the Oslo Triennale, and London Design Museum and the Storefront for Art and Architecture. We're in Storefront tonight. Where are we?
I think you're in the storefront. Yes.
It feels like the storefront to me. Yes.
Yes.
So Kallipoliti is the recipient of the Webby Award, grants from the Graham Foundation and the New York State Councils for the Arts, an honorable mention at the Shenzhen Biennale, a Fulbright Scholar, and the ACSA Annual Award for Creative Achievement. Oh, very good. Recently, her practice, Anna Cycle, was recognized as a leading innovator in sustainable design in Build's 2019 and 2020 Design and Build Awards. While her book was a finalist among all publications in design, art, and architecture in 2008 for the Cornish Family Prize by the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne, Kallipoliti holds a diploma in architecture and engineering from AUTH how would you say that? In Greece?
It's Aristotle University of
Greece?
Thessaloniki. That's where I'm from.
Awesome. And a SMARCS from MIT, which I didn't know, and a PhD from Princeton School of Architecture. Please welcome Lydia Kallipoliti. After she's given about an hour lecture, we will have a Q&A, which you can all attendees can ask questions and get involved. So stay. Thanks.
Stephen, thank you so much for this really generous introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. I am super excited to have met you before the world shut down at the last conference of architecture in the world. I'm so psyched with seeing all of these images. It's like an ego self-fulfillment, but still it's very warming. So thank you. I couldn't say hi to my friend Jimenez Lai, who just texted me, and I'm like not very able to do a lot of things in Zoom. So hi Jimenez, and we'll talk soon. And thank you so much for joining us today. So I'm gonna start sharing my screen and talk about closed worlds. Let's first of all share the screen, which is hopefully gonna be okay. Can you all see it? All good?
Yes.
Okay, so I wrote this book, The Architecture of Closed Worlds, or What is the Power of Shit, in 2018. Just give me 1 second, because for some reason I cannot change my slides. Oh, no, now it's good. So when I wrote that book, I was thinking of the idea of containment as a kind of paradoxical but telling history of the 20th century. Now, all of a sudden, we are all living in closed worlds, like an eerie self-fulfillment of the days. And one of the things that I decided to do in the title was to do a title which is reflective of a canonical history of environmental design. Let's say The Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment by Rainer Banham, and a subtitle that is much uglier than that, that is much more visceral and raw, and What is the Power of Shit refers to that, just to convey that questions of ecology of the environment are not just about control and tempering, abstraction and statistics, but also about the raw visceral nature of materiality and the way that we experience life. And I'm really living through that, and like everybody else right now. So I'm going to start with a very basic question to describe this work, and at the very end I'm going to reflect on some current developments and thoughts, new ideas of offspring projects that are coming out of this prior work. So what is a closed world? I'm definitely not the first person that has used this term. In fact, historian of science Paul Edwards has written a book called The Closed World, and his story was about, it was a revisionist account of computing in Cold War America, and he was trying to explain the idea of a closed world through the feedback loop, information that cycles back into itself. Whereas in my story, I was examining a parallel but divergent history in the 20th century, a genealogy of contained microcosms with the ambition to take parts of the Earth and replicate the Earth in its totality, to register a series of living experiments that forge what I tentatively called in the book a synthetic type of naturalism, where the laws of nature and metabolism were displaced from the domain of wilderness to the domain of cities and buildings. The idea of the world in a bottle is absolutely not new to architects. Here we see just a very small sample of an art project by Hausrucker Co. You might know this famous Viennese group. It's becoming very popular these days with the masks and the balloons and the kind of resurgence of the bubble as a sterilization immune system that becomes protective of the body. Here, what they do for an art fair in Cologne in 1973 is put a piece of nature, almost like Logier's primitive hut, inside a jar. That was republished in the cover of Casabella. And the piece of nature, by the minute that it becomes inserted inside this jar, it becomes a fossil. It becomes a testament of the fact that nature has died, it no longer exists, and we're trying to preserve it as a kind of specimen to observe and to look onto. But in fact, architecture's role in the reconstruction of idealized microcosm is tied to the history of utopia. And here we see a very famous image, iconic illustration of Buckminster Fuller and Soji Sadao of Utopia in 1960 that shields a privileged population in Midtown Manhattan. So if we think of Buckminster Fuller and Sadao's dome over Manhattan or Rainer Banham's environmental bubble, we realize that these are iconic illustrations of a period of intense environmental anxiety because they manifest, like the jarred fossil, our lost idea of the untamed and uncontrolled land. In fact, our canonical understanding of utopia, which is almost visualized in this iconic project of Claude Nicolas Ledoux, Royal Salt Works, is very close to the idealization of a closed system, a self-sustaining physical environment that is demarcated from its surroundings. And you see in this image how clearly the perimeter is physically marking a ground territory by a boundary that does not allow for the transfer of matter energy and re-regulates both material and civic interactions within its borders. In the post-war period, one of my arguments in the book was that the idea of utopia reappeared through the reenactment of whole Earth systems. The recirculation of resources in the global ecosystem was idealized in the idea of circularity and containment in a number of projects that have proliferated following the war. In this sense, closed worlds are not only key sites of engineering and environmental production, but have also materialized a utopian project, which is to temper and fabricate the environment as a site of architectural production. However, closed worlds are no longer utopic metaphors. They're not lost utopias. And here, obviously, you see a movie which is an iconic architecture movie of Jacques Tati, Playtime, but it represents an environment that has become profitably real, the corporate interior, the kind of indoors where we spend 90% of our time based on the latest report from the Environmental Protection Agency, which means that our indoor environments are in fact politically charged spaces that reflect social ideals and culturally specific standards of taste and judgment. Confined within artificial enclosures, environmental control has enforced biased standards of life, even though in most cases, these standards institutionalize absurd criteria that homogenize ideas for comfort and well-being for the entirety of the human race. So an argument of the book is that closed worlds are not just materially enclosed systems that contain bodies and materials, but also power structures that maintain and manage constancy over bodies and psyches. The establishment of this model thermal equilibrium in interior spaces since the 1950s, sequestered comfort zones that are held within narrow ranges. And on the screen, you see the narrow range of comfort defined between the red and the orange line. It reflects an understanding of the body as a tool within a constant atmospheric medium in order to control and predict its behavior and growth. It is precisely this mechanical vision of biology that gives life specifically a modern character. If organisms, either people or plants, are examined explicitly as mechanical structures serving a physical equilibrium, one cannot account for the complexity, but neither for the beauty of life. So overall, in this book, I argue that the history of 20th century architecture, design, and engineering has been strongly linked to the conceptualization and production of closed systems. As partial reconstructions of the world in time and in space, closed systems speak of the eerie transference of life using architecture as a medium and a vessel to secure a compulsive cycling of matter, energy, data, and capital. The projects documented in the book represent entirely antithetical political agendas. They range from military experiments to countercultural projects to more recently the kind of questionable concept of ecological tourism and environmental capitalism. In all cases, the projects documented in the book are real. They are not speculative projects. They were implemented, and that was something very important for me to really test the way that they have been tested and reported rather than just speculated upon. So in the book, basically, I examine an archive, but to witness the kind of story of the ideological migration of the different kinds of projects that I have tentatively called closed worlds, I'm going to show you three and kind of analyze them in some relative depth in order to extract points for a manifesto on closed worlds and the paradox of containment. So I'm going to start from the most famous project, probably that was part of this book and part of the exhibition, the Biosphere 2 in Arizona, and the idea of self-organization versus Darwinian evolution. Biosphere 2, if you don't know it, it's an incredible experience to visit it in Arizona, right outside of Tucson. Remains the largest and most famous ecological system ever built. The purpose of it was to test the viability of a biologically regenerative artificial environment that supports human habitation in space and to provide a prototype Earth colony in case the Earth would be destroyed. It was built by a company that was self-proclaimed Space Biospheres Venture, a partnership between Ed Bass, that was a businessman and a philanthropist, who spent approximately $200 million to build and sustain the facility, and John Allen, that was a systems ecologist and environmentalist. Biosphere 2 supported two missions. The first team of researchers entered the facility in 1991 and were locked entirely from the exterior world for 2 years and 20 minutes. The team produced their own food and air supply within a heavily sequestered series of ecosystems. During the entire experiment, all of their waste, including waste from their domesticated animals, was recycled with natural low-tech filtration methods. What Biosphere 2 is famous for, and I will explain why you're seeing this, is for failing spectacularly and very publicly. The first mission was notorious for technical and operational failures, especially for not creating enough oxygen. After 6 months, oxygen absorption went down by 6%, which is very, very significant. And one of the hypotheses was that raw concrete that was used to make the facility was absorbing the oxygen while it was curing. There are other theories of why the oxygen levels fell down, one of which was that soil was absorbing oxygen from bacteria and the growth of life, of stuff. But if you take this operational failure, which was uncalculated by the mathematical simulations, along with poor interior air quality, unanticipated species like cockroaches and this crazy ant that you see on the screen thrived, with nobody understanding why this happened. The biospherians also suffered from hunger throughout the 2 years of their residency. So there were a lot of uncalculated terrible failures in the project. But the second mission also failed. It became infamous not so much for technical failures, because it lasted very, very little, but for mutiny and public feuds among different stakeholders that were involved in the facility's management. In time, the philosopher-scientist character, John Allen, that you see on the screen, argued very intensely with Ed Bass, who financed the project. The latter camp claimed that Allen, this guy, and his synergists, in quotes, were destroying the scientific credibility of the experiment, and Bass took action in hiring the now controversial white nationalist Stephen Bannon to write Space Biosphere's venture. The involvement of Bannon, who was at the time manager of Bannon & Co. investment banking in Beverly Hills, was detrimental to the project. With Bass and Bannon's endorsement, the second team of biospherians who entered the facility in 1994 were ambushed by federal marshals. The two men concluded that the founding management team included Allen and his cult synergists had to go. In retaliation, the synergists, the scientists, sabotaged the second experiment. They opened the airlocks of Biosphere 2, claiming concern over the health of the residents, and were later arrested. The mission was compromised, and it ended soon thereafter. Bannon also had an open quarrel with this biospherian who was in the first mission, Abigail Ailing, and their quarrel was originally published in the Tucson Citizen in 1996, resurfacing in the media during the US presidential elections of 2016. It disclosed a series of threats, insults, and accusations of sexual harassment. So arguably, one could say that the material problems of the closed world in the first mission that were evident were rendered as social and political problems in the second human mission. Both events revealed that the idea of dynamic equilibrium and material exchange in an arbitrarily chosen part of the Earth's biosphere cannot just set in spontaneously. Redundancy of species and the logic of inclusiveness cannot automatically lead to the cybernetic equilibrium that Allen so earnestly wanted to prove. What is mostly important is that the battle between Allen and Bass exposes an important dichotomy in environmental politics, that between the idealization of self-organization and the brutality of Darwinian evolution, which was transposed to social order and policy. In many ways, Biosphere 2 exhibits a mythology of consensus based on natural principles and furthers the belief that equilibrium should be translated to social policy and societal values. As a living experiment, the Biosphere 2 has demonstrated that the limits of sustainability and the risks associated with closed ecosystems remain largely unknown. After years of self-reliance, the editor of the Holler's catalog, Stuart Brand, confessed that the idea of energy autonomy, which is something that he was working for and longing for a very long time, was a kind of hysteria. Brand's kinship between the closed system and the hysteric body is critical if we think of Freud's definition of hysteria as a physiological internal modification of the nervous system. To describe the symptoms of hysteria, Freud spoke of closure as a type of modification that affects an organism alone instead of one that affects an organism and its surroundings. Psychoanalytically, this corresponds to a stage called the protopsyche, at which an organism has control over nothing except for itself. Ultimately, it functions like an ad hoc closed system, regenerating materials out of what is available within the borders of one's body. Another important conclusion out of this story is that the idea that circularity has fostered a kind of perception of Earth holding. a progeny of Earth photographs that are held gently and affectionately by human hands as if the Earth is a wounded baby that needs care. This anthropomorphic perception of the Earth as an endangered living species that is cute and sentient, as a being that needs to be petted by us humans, is delusional, as it positions us at the center of all pivotal planetary developments when we are definitely not. Our perception of the Earth as one interconnected world, as an image that promotes unity and balance, is no longer the case. Unilateral strategies for divergent problems, in the ideological belief that the metabolism of the planet may become the foundation for technology, culture, and design, is no longer applicable. The whole Earth catalog is not so whole anymore, or never was whole to begin with. So from this kind of colossal governmental project that required substantial venture capital and vast resources of experimentation, prototyping, construction, and communication, we're going to move to a very humble countercultural project, an urban intervention in the city using minimal resources, the Integral Urban House in 1974, and the idea of digestive autonomy, or the power of shit. As the project of an underground community group, we will look into the Integral Urban House that was a domestic organization in an urban setting, envisioned by its founders as a healthy natural cyclical system. The project was initiated by Helga and William Olkowski and funded by the nonprofit organization Farallone's Institute that was founded by Sim van der Ren, a pioneer in sustainable architecture that was at the time the state architect of California. The actual setting was a typical house in Berkeley, California, that was retrofitted by the Farallone's Institute to a highly productive test bed for self-reliance, resource renewal, and recycling of waste materials. What was mostly interesting was that the house was very much tied to its inhabitants with an umbilical cord. It needed constant maintenance, and the dwellers were linked to the house in a very corporeal way. The ecosystem of the house was then linked to an entire community of stakeholders that would each play a specific role within a larger scheme of actions. According to the founders, it was significant to repeatedly explain the scheme of action and the plan of life to all members that would have to commit to specific behavioral protocols before entering and living in the house, very much like in the case of support groups of anonymous alcoholics or any other kind of support group. This formative habitation brings an important kind of point that I'm making in the book, which is that the occupant of a closed world is in many ways its guinea pig. This was a term that Buckminster Fuller called himself as in an anonymous essay that he wrote, Guinea Pig B, B for Bucky. A guinea pig does not observe and speculate on possible outcomes. Rather, it is willful to insert its bodily parts inside a living experiment. The closed world dweller is therefore its feeder and caretaker. He or she monitors it closely and safeguards its operation. And some examples that are kind of cross-referencing throughout different case studies in the book is this one. This is Auguste Picard, who was a French balloonist that was the part of a large family of Earth balloonists in France, that was the first person that reached the stratosphere in a hermetically sealed aluminum gondola that he designed, and went up there along with his assistant, almost reaching his death. He accidentally survived because air currents dropped him in the Alps when they were not supposed to. This is Evgeny Shepelev, who was the first human to remain inside a closed system for 90 hours. In Bios 3, that was an experiment of the Siberian branch in Russia in 1972. And for 90 hours, he only breathed oxygen that was produced by a certain type of algae, chlorella to be specific. And this is the sketch of British architect Graham Kane, who built an ecological house that would generate gas methane just out of his own excrements. And this is his sketch of him becoming a living part of the house that he designed and built, in the middle becoming himself, portraying himself as the primary digester. So while ecological systems of the post-war period portrayed the inhabitant as an indispensable part of a building ecology, currently this image is dismissed. Environmental concerns promote a type of conservationist ethic and a list of cautionary daily practices of scarcity. And yet there is nothing more visceral as a participatory spatial experience than the voluntary containment of the subject inside the premises of a closed world. Overall, the ambition of the integral urban house was not to change the system holistically, but to reorient waste as a productive byproduct that fosters different pathways or more possibilities for each cycle of resources. Food productions yielded from the management of organic and inorganic waste was key to the integral urban house, as well as to several other domestic experiments at the time that promoted the idea of self-reliance from the grid of urban supplies. Making food from shit was the ultimate aspiration that was in fact carried out by tedious, repetitive, and dirty routines like sorting, composting, mixing mulch for vegetation and animal feed and crops. With these aims in mind, the space of the house was nurtured and dependent on the subtle fluctuations of material phase changes and the growth of living substances. To achieve these challenging conversions, the Institute researched not only on countercultural low-tech methods, but this kind of conversion processing was researched by major industrial stakeholders like General Electric that were investigating the possibilities of thermophilic bacteria that had the potential to create protein from the waste of livestock and in forming bacteria soups which could break down cellulosic waste into protein for animal feed. So this type of research was conducted by General Electric in their ongoing effort to chemically engineer bacteria that would become tools and perform specific efficient tasks like eating toxins found in petroleum. Specifically, this microbiologist, Ananda Chakrabarty, who was a genetic engineer that worked for GE in 1972, developed a man-made living organism that combined features of several strains of Pseudomonas bacteria that would eat toxins found in petroleum. He attempted to patent the bacteria, and the patent office was rejected, leading to a famous United States Supreme Court case known as the Diamond versus Chakrabarty case on whether genetically modified organisms could be patented. The court ruled in Chakrabarty's favor, stating that the fact that microorganisms are alive, but this is without of any legal consequence for the purposes of the patent law. Nevertheless, the court case did raise ethical questions as to where life begins and what are the ethics involved in pre-engineering the autonomy of microorganism. It also silently introduced into the field of designing and building as a field of semi-autonomy or disobedience of matter. Now it is a fact that maybe shit can be turned into food, and that Graham Kane and the Farallones Institute were not so delusional after all. Nevertheless, with the introduction of these questions into the field of architecture and design, one inevitably accepts that if ecological houses are in fact digestive machines, they are sometimes disobedient. And this is what autonomy means in many respects. Even though ecosystems are mostly portrayed as robust circular systems that perform a recycling task, where waste equals food in a series of cycles and subcycles, the idea of self-sufficiency is compulsive and maybe hysteric in the will to always generate new life from shit. Therefore, to write a counter-history to optimized circular economies in material conversions, one needs to look at shit, because only through this raw confrontation may the ecology of life be somehow useful. Shit forces us to look at questions of ecology viscerally, via the raw ecology of our bodies and the understanding that recycling is not just a statistical problem related to the management of urban resources, but also a basic bodily reality that affects the water and the air we breathe. Our unwanted, degenerate bodily products have been described as technically powerful and worthy because they can make methane, meaning power, if treated properly. So recycling shit to money is as much a subject of theoretical analysis as much as a factual constituent of capitalist production. Waste needs to go away, and this very process of purging, transporting, and carrying into oblivion everything that is worthless is very profitable for those who manage and transfer this material. To be more specific, New York City, the beating heart of global finance and culture, creates an enormous amount of shit. As reporter Oliver Millman wrote in The Guardian a few years ago, a substantial amount of the city's excrement are expelled to Alabama with this train, causing major stink methane clouds 900 miles away. The treated sewage, euphemistically known in the industry as biosolids, travels by a poo train to a landfill west of Birmingham, causing what the locals call the death smell. In Alabama, the avalanche of northern poo is part of a wider concern over the environmental risks for residents, particularly the impoverished and people of color. The dismissal of the environmental concerns of Alabama residents, mostly residents of overwhelmingly African American communities, has been reported as a case of civil rights and environmental racism. Let us not forget that more than a material, shit also indicates a general state of incoherency, degeneration, and malevolence. It indicates a stage where information is so finely grained and scattered that it cannot form identifiable patterns. So from shit, we're moving to compulsive happiness and the architecture of Walt Disney in his dream world, closed world, the Epcot, that was never materialized as he wished it. Still, it is a thriving example of a closed world. And the closed world becomes a controlled city in Walt Disney's dream project, Epcot, which is an abbreviation for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. Epcot was a controlled, sanitized, and protected circular city, providing not only a new theme park of entertainment and leisure, but also new living patterns for happy dwellers, which is what Disney was hoping for. Disney truly believed that happiness could be designed by using technology, and more specifically, that he could design the happiness of happy dwellers by regulating pollution, trash, ventilation, and electricity to offer leisure and comfort to his citizens. And here you see a kind of audience dispossessed by Mickey Mouse in the 1930s, which is very telling of the idea of the city that he was wishing to manufacture. The Disney ideal offered uncomplicated, wholesome entertainment inside Disney's own pre-engineered fantasy, an idea which was as much a closed world as the physical city that he conceived himself. Epcot was critiqued heavily for subsuming the history of utopia, from Claude Nicolas Ledoux to Ebenezer Howard, from the American City Beautiful movement of the 1890s to Victor Gruen's urban models, along with the added benefits of improving air quality and weather comfort. It was a living laboratory and a technology showroom for future cities, just when cities throughout the world were decaying and disintegrating. In Epcot, each house had its own fuel cells and was connected to a centralized waste collection system, water supply, and living farm using swamplands and filtering plants. All of it was also connected by this monorail running through the center and tying all parts of the property. But most importantly, the city center was meant to be enclosed in a climatically controlled dome that was almost like a copy-paste version of Buckminster Fuller's dome over Manhattan. Disney was largely critiqued, and this is one such critique by architectural and cultural critics, for his earnest belief in controlling human emotions through the sovereignty of territory and in the pursuit of happiness as a game of managing comfort and human physiology. He loved astronauts, and this is one performance of an astronaut in Epcot in the film in 1966. He even dressed Mickey Mouse as an astronaut multiple times, and that was, and he did a collaboration with Vernon Brown in a movie. Why were astronauts so important to him? Because they represented the perception of life as a feedback loop of input and output, as the process of combustion and oxidation, which was widespread in the design of the spacesuit as a life support system, and in the understanding also of the trauma following the war. And you see here a kind of illustration of the input and output of an astronaut as let's say, the diagramming of life as input and output. In fact, Jewish psychiatrist and neurologist Viktor Frankl, in his best-selling book Man's Search for Meaning, written after his stay at a Nazi concentration camp, argued that the difference between those who had lived and those who had died came down to one thing: their ability to find meaning in the most trivial, repetitive, and mechanical tasks of life. In his own words, happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue, and could in fact ensue from the meaning of sustaining life through a series of problem-solving challenges of input and output. Similarly, one of the major accomplishments of the Disney World, according to the American Magazine of the Design Environment, was a problem-solving endeavor of creating a pollution control system that was unprecedented, of really using input and output in the most efficient way, and the invention of these underground channels that are called the utilidors. It's an underground network of tunnels that contains a series of systems to handle the waste that the park produces in an entirely closed system. And this system has not only been used in Disneyland, but also in other locations like Roosevelt Island, for example, in New York, has utilidors, and it has been applied to major housing developments in the 1970s and 80s. The idealization of circularity reveals a deeply rooted problem of deduction in environmental representation, which is visualized almost exclusively with the use of arrows. And this is a kind of remnant of the input-output drawing of relationships. Since the 1960s, ecologist Howard Odom's energy systems language, Energess, has instrumentalized ecosystems as well as human agency in terms of input and output. This representational language for ecological simulation models is derivative directly from electronic circuits, but has become the primary tool for architects to visualize performance and energy flow. Arrows, however legible, they remove a type of drawing agency that becomes critical to our field. The question becomes, could alternative notation systems and fields effectively replace arrows, given that arrows point only to the end goal of conversions, but say very little about the process of recycling itself? The Chilean biologist Francisco Varela argued that cognitive systems cannot be understood explicitly on the basis of their input and output relationships, but by their operational closure. Thus, the language of environmental representation represents a process of interlinked threads, while these threads and processes are trying to develop a relationship with themselves. In the environment, perception is seen as a cognitive process of hypothesis formation, not as a simple prescription or reflection of pre-given information. A closed world, therefore, along with its dwellers, is a new type of unbalanced ecosystemic model susceptible to the shortcomings of digestion. what remains a paradox is the manner in which this questionable model, imbued with the vitalism of a digestive stomach, has prevailed as the mainstream model of what we now call a sustainable net zero habitat opposing energy loss. In this light, it is critical to question to what degree resource conservation strategies are sustainable forms of practice, and also recognize how impossible ideas become institutionalized through a series of bureaucratic mechanisms that are eventually labeled as eco-friendly or even worse, as green. So now that I have explained, just give me 1 second. Now that I've explained the kind of 3 of the case studies, to delve deeper into some of the problems at stake while referencing closed worlds, I'm going to show you a little bit about how the overall project Closed World has manifested beyond the format of the book. And it has manifested as an exhibition, which you all know since you have it on your screens and are fulfilling my ego, an online lexicon, a website, and a number of courses. And this is one image of the first iteration of the exhibition, which somebody told me very recently that it's very eerie because it manifests social distancing. Each cylinder was supposed to be occupied by one person and was exactly 6 feet. And so you couldn't go inside one cylinder, one closed world with another person. It was a series of individualized experiences. That here you see the gallery without people. And the virtual reality environment that was designed by Farzan Lofty Jam was also holding people apart, tethered in this rail, 6 feet apart. The exhibition then moved, this is to actually your location in Los Angeles 1 year ago, where a lot of my very dear friends, including Jimenez, participated in a small event at that. Daniel Lopez Perez, Anthony Fontenot, and a couple of others. This is also in Los Angeles in 2019. And then it headed to Sydney in May 2019. At that point, I didn't want to move it anymore. And now it cannot go anywhere, obviously, because of the situation. So this is the lexicon, which can be accessed online, which are all the it's a series of terms that are semi-architectural, that were used in the scientific technical reports of each project. And I thought it would be very interesting to think of these terms spatially, like what is the kind of meaning of acclimatization of the body performing and kind of getting used to a certain kind of environment, forming this kind of lexicon. And one of the questions that I was asking at the end is whether this is a kind of marginal story, a deviant story of architectural history. And I have received that critique. In fact, Mimi Zeiger wrote a review in Metropolis, and one of the criticisms that she told me at some point was, many of these projects are feats of science, engineering, and technology, with architecture merely playing a part. And in some ways, it is true that a closed world, as it was included in the book, was manifesting a type of death wish of the design object. But in my view, architecture was not replaced altogether with science and engineering. It was not erasing itself. It was just displaced from a field that shapes the use and the form of the physical world to a sensorial, immersive environment that copies and simulates the metabolism and experiential aptitudes of the natural world. And this kind of version of the less formal but more sensorial material understanding of the world is becoming very prevalent these days. So far, the role of building technology was to insulate spaces from environmental flows, from things outside. This method has suggested historically a kind of moral discipline that would protect buildings against disease, transferring an ideological framework of theology and ethics to the microrealm of materials. Nevertheless, in a new reality that is inundated with sudden climatic changes, methane gas clouds, oceanic islands of decomposed debris, and now the pandemic, a new role is cast to the notion of environment. Instead of it being the inactive, static, and historicized context within which an architectural object is placed, the environment quite literally becomes the object of design itself. It is also not a marginal history because closed worlds very much reflect the modern human subject, which is immersed in a carefully curated replication or reverberation of the world as a pre-engineered fantasy. If you have not seen this documentary, it's like only 3 minutes by Saturday Night Live. I really urge you to see it. It's hilarious. Where basically Buckminster Fuller's dome over Manhattan is transported to Brooklyn to shield all of political liberals from encountering the reality of the Republicans outside this bubble. So because we encounter an unimaginable amount of information in our daily lives, the only way to navigate is to curate the content relative to oneself, or as French philosopher Quentin Meillassoux has put it, in a kind of relational loss with context. As a machine of ingestion and excretion, but also as a primer operator of labor-entailing tasks, the sealed subject is both an experimental subject inside a larger experiment, but also the monitoring agent of the experiment itself. And this is where we are right now. In this sense, bodies are no more than expressions of change, carefully mapped and monitored. Within the premises of closed worlds, bodies are reorganized and packed and distributed in space to yield other resources. And this is just a kind of scattered series of thoughts on contemporary life as we experiencing it now in containment. So the idea of enclosure, the kind of the reality that we live, the thin border between the world and the inside world and the outside world, has a kind of long legacy in utopia, science fiction, in outer space. Here you see a close-up of that thin film border from the movie First Man by Daniel Chazelle, that represents Neil Armstrong returning from the moon to the Earth, being in quarantine for 21 days. This was a kind of precautionary measure taken by NASA to not allow contamination, alien life contamination coming to Earth. But there was also, this was called incoming contamination. Forwarding contamination would be the type of contamination of us spreading our biological material to other planetary bodies, like in the universe. So that idea of containment, here you see another image of this kind of like looking inside an airlock. This is the US Hornet, which was a transitional facility where the astronauts returning from the moon and were quarantined would come to this window and talk to other humans. And this is them greeting Richard Nixon after their return from the moon. And this is the actual facility, the mobile quarantine facility. But this idea of containment was like looking through the airlock is very, very dominant in scientific imagery, in science fiction imagery, reminding us that that line is something that we try very desperately to maintain. The kind of fear of breach becomes a predominant factor of understanding what is inside and outside. Here you have other images from Bios 3. But this is no longer kind of a sci-fi. It's the reality that we experience right now. And these are images that were taken about 2 weeks ago in Brooklyn from a really interesting photographer, Stephen Lovkin, of people in Brooklyn about 20 days ago, sending messages through windows, living life in containment, showing us that the line between social reality and science fiction is a kind of optical illusion. In our new reality, in this, let's say the age of extinction, we have revised how we navigate autonomy and territoriality from inside to outside. Renewed protocols for leaving and entering the household are forged. The process of departure and re-entry expands the thresholds of the door to an elongated space of serial decontamination steps. The door is now an airlock, necessitated to enter the unfriendly and unforgiving void of a foreign planet outside. Our households are spaceships, while the outside has become a defamiliarized, non-cohesive space where urbanity has transformed into a series of constellations of essential places, supermarkets, gas stations, hospitals, and pharmacies. All else is erased in a newly formed type of mental desert. Our cities are now vast arrays of disconnected bedrooms, microcosms that come together in an abstract digital space, physically enabled by data farms, which also constitute our vital, essential places of current livelihood, although many times overlooked. With no hope of exteriority, the question becomes how long can we live in individualized containers? The desire to shrink the world, to alter it and condense it to a manageable territory within confined borders is manifestly impalpable. Our current condition of detachment and restraint that speaks for long-standing ideals like autonomy, self-sufficiency, and individualism is nothing but a crumble of ruins. It is a kind of hysteria. If we reflect on Freud's definition, he described hysteria as a spatial condition where the organism is controlling nothing except for itself and brings only changes out of materials available within the borders of the body. In this new world, we're possibly in dire need of a new kind of criticism, of new ways to fathom with interiorization, and of methods to move past barriers in the way that we narrate stories through the design of our environments, as well as the shaping of our reality. As citizens and creative thinkers, we need to zoom out and effect real change, now that returning to the long normality as was is no longer attainable. As a famous movie line suggests, open your eyes to the bubble inside which you're voluntarily contained. Then develop an erotic but also resistant relationship with your containment. In that way, it might be possible to penetrate barriers and imagine other ways of being, even to imagine some real grounds of hope beyond the market commodity of an economic and social euphoria for the few. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Should I stop sharing or?
Yeah, stop sharing. That'd be fantastic. And then we'll get into
Okay.
I'm sure there's going to be 1,000 questions.
All right. Awesome. Sure. 1,000.
Yeah, that was an awesome conversation. Your research, besides being so incredibly topical, I mean, it's so well done and it's so deep and thoughtful and rich. I don't know. It's probably one of the most interesting I felt like it was a conversation actually, which is kind of cool because we were all there in the gallery. But
I am so
very, very cool.
Humbled and honored that you say that. Thank you.
No, it's maybe it's also because I'm just so interested in it, but I also think it's so topical. And then I immediately kind of just want to maybe jump to, I know there's going to be so many ecological discourses that are going to come out of this that you've kind of wrapped your head into, and also the inside-outside discourse as well, and its relationship to contemporary social culture, which are just completely right on. I also want to just say, hey, I want to kind of ask a little bit about the motivation. Like you get into this deep, not your motivation per se, although it is a human motivation. Now that you've studied all these almost like I kind of saw them as Earth as a petri dish, and that Earth is this massive petri dish of experimentation that has gone on, especially in the 70s, but all since the 20s onward through science and engineering, all to create, in my mind, this fantastical Elon Musk fantasy, which isn't a fantasy, of basically, you know, moving life beyond the Earth and into outer space and colonizing planets. And here are the experiments in order to try to achieve that. I'm curious what you think about that, what you think is sort of these motivations, if that is indeed sort of maybe what's embedded in a lot of these scientific efforts, but also the cultural efforts of humanity and our role as humans and our use of the Earth. You really did pose a question about sustainability being problematic. What are we sustaining? Of course, we've heard that. But then, you know, if you think about House Rucker and the way they made those, you know, again, a petri dish or an experiment of nature where nature is now a specimen to be observed and analyzed and becomes part of the discourse, whether or not it gets to come with us is probably a question. I don't know if you understood my question, but
maybe.
Yeah, it's about that motivation.
It's a very deep question. The motivation is multivalent. Like it's not honed directly only to the desire of conquering territoriality outside of Earth. What I was really fascinated with is how this idea to kind of extract a section of the Earth and understand it from zero was replicating itself in different modalities of living, of life, architecture, design. So a lot of the countercultural people in the 60s and 70s that believed politically in the idea of autonomy to disengage themselves from, let's say, the electrical grid to generate their own energy and enable a population that would have no access to electricity to power themselves. They were using the same kind of methodologies and the same kind of line of thinking as the kind of NASA experts that were trying to conquer the moon. So one of the things that interested me in this research was how the same motivation to extract a part of the world, replicate it, live as in an individualized type of container, and replicate life using technological instrumentation represented entirely different groups of people, and why that was the case.
Well,
Another motivation. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, then my sense of what you just said is it seems that group of people are quite a privileged community to be able to get off the grid, to own property, to have territory, to have space where you can enable and manage a self-created lifestyle that doesn't require external resources is a very privileged point. Not many.
It is. You're absolutely right. I think that, but there are many veins to that, and it's kind of subtle. For example, this idea is tied to the legacy of American individualism, and a lot of, you know, one of the things also Leo Marx said it in The Machine in the Garden, definitely, how there's a kind of inherent propensity of American life to be autonomous in the wild, to have machines in the garden, to kind of use the machinery that is available as if it is some God-gifted legacy that was given to them, and so Americans to have guns and be completely on their own, autonomous. So that is reflecting a kind of idea of a privilege of individualism. At the same time, there were other groups and some utopian groups, for example, they wanted to include people that didn't have other means, a community, like the Integral Urban House was a community. And they were not understanding it in this way. They were doing technically very similar things to generate power. But the, let's say, behavioral protocols and the living patterns that they were putting forward to sustain autonomy were very different. They all failed. So that was a common denominator crossing all of the different examples. Failure was the common denominator. And failure is not as, oh, see, here's a failed history. Failure is interesting as to what is the drive, the existential, ontological, and human drive to carry on so explicitly in, you know, doing a project that you know will not work, that will not. So what is it? Why do we still believe in that total circularity? Why were humans so interested in frictionless movement and endless circular movement before it was discovered that there is no such thing, or there cannot be such thing? Because there's a kind of persistence in idealizing certain existential models like circularity, and that was very interesting to me, to see how that was, how that notion, how that drive was expressing itself spatially, technically, socially, and politically in different kinds of projects. And also, the kind of another major drive was the scientific method of exclusion, to let's say, scientists to investigate, to examine a very complex phenomenon. They use a petri dish as a sample of a larger reality, right? They extract the sample and they focus on what happens within a kind of small sample to deduct conclusions for a larger open field. And that's something that's very interested also in the history of ecology outside of architecture, right? How from the field we have moved to the laboratory, and what are the methods and protocols with which the environmental science, sustainability, ecology have been understood. So architecture is part of that story as well. And I was interested in the kind of specialization, let's say, of this scientific methodology.
That's very, very cool. Jimenez, he has a question. I think you can actually talk if you unmute yourself.
Yeah, I can talk. I mean,
oh, he's there.
Hey, I'm here.
Jimenez, your picture makes you look 15 years younger.
Because I was 15 years younger in that photograph. Yeah, no, recently a friend told me that I sort of look like Katie Lang in that photograph, which I take as an absolute compliment. Katie Lang was so hot. No, but I wanted to know, we've had a bunch of conversations about your work, and last year we had 2 opportunities to publicly talk about it, you know, and so I have a lot more. I mean, you know, it's just continued to develop over time, and super exciting to listen to it, you know, now with a fresh set of sensors. No, but I'm thinking about a couple of things. One of which is, you know, Catherine Ingram's description of what is nature or what is wilderness. The way she talks about it is that, you know, at this point in time, the status of a park is if we draw a line around it and call it a park. You know, humans. If a park is a political decision, it is no longer a natural occurrence. You know, I find that to be super. I mean, but then the reason why I'm starting over there is because my second point, I'm just wondering about Mimi's criticism, which I found surprising. You know, I found her criticism to be surprising. To consider this work non-architectural is weird because, you know, if we talk about the inside-outside discourse, right? If we say humans, time and again, if it's hot outside, we made it cool inside. If it's wet outside, we make it dry inside. We just consistently defy what's outside, you know, the air quote nature. And suddenly this opens the door for your work to form unlikely allies and accidental comrades. So I don't know, like the more obvious ones would be Philippe Rahm, right? or other obvious ones would be Sean Lally. These accidental allies were, unlikely comrades.
Accidental allies. I know Philip and very well.
I mean, but then, before all this, one might not have associated your work with his, but now that you've articulated your train of thought, suddenly it's not at all weird to be thinking about this type of air architecture, the way that Ron might have talked about it, all the way back to the way that maybe Yves Klein would have talked about it. It opens the door to accidental,
Right.
comrades. Have you, and which is why I opened with Catherine Ingram, because suddenly I also see her work as, somehow in alliance or having camaraderie with yours. Have you, maybe this takes time, but I wonder if there are new, because, even this guy I introduced you last year, Theo Triumphalitis, the VR person, even then, I think there's a kind of overlap in discourse. So I wonder if over time you've sort of identified even more sort of dialogues or allies or camaraderies that's forming because of this work.
Right. No, that's a really good question. And I miss you, Jimenez. Let's start with that. I've thought about it quite a bit in containment, obviously, while children were jumping on my head. It's not about, I'm not sure if it's about the distinction between something material and immaterial that becomes relevant through this project, or what makes me energized. So not, let's say, looking at this room as a kind of representation of earth currents relative to against formal logic, like a bookshelf or this or that. I'm thinking of that what in this new situation that we're experiencing right now, what is absolutely astonishing and new is how we think of bodies intersecting other bodies, of bodies intersecting objects that have been touched, of everything becoming part of a series of networks of relationships that change our perception of space. And I don't know if that brings to light something, an object versus an immaterial environment, a sensorial environment, which is what I said in the lecture, basically. But I'm thinking that this all of a sudden becomes very important, right? Like to think of a surface or an object like a door handle. Like we constantly think of fences, door handles, when you open a door, who has touched it, right? Who was here? What are the kind of crossings of people? So everything becomes relevant. So I think that if we think of Philip Brahms' work, what is becoming excruciatingly important is a different modality of representation in a space, which is not defined by a Cartesian coordinate system where we have X object, Y object, and so on and so forth, but we have other kinds of vectors and distances and relationships that are defining how we understand and conceptualize space. So in that light, definitely I think that the work that Philip is doing, or Sean Lally, or other people that you will know better than me, and you can tell me which ones they are, is becoming hugely relevant, not because it's studying air versus form, but because it's understanding spatial relationships in a different way. And we are at the crux of understanding spatial relationships in a different way. And I think that we're going to have to deal with that, right? I don't know what's going to happen or how long this will last, if we go back to something, but it might actually change the way that we analyze and perceive phenomena. And I think that that becomes very relevant. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but this is my thinking for the time being.
Yeah. Yes. But I guess part of my question is also thinking, are there unlikely friendships or unlikely dialogues, that's worth considering in moving forward with your research, I guess.
I'm all for unlikely friendships and dialogues.
I might add So kind of something that Jimenez just brought up, also surrounding Mimi's, or your reading, I guess, of Mimi's article, because it was your
You
interpretation.
can just read it. It's
Yeah, I
not
gotta
my
read it.
reading.
It's a reading. It's a reading of it, where she seems to have made some sort of assessment of this type of architecture as being technologically engineered oriented, and yet all of it is form oriented. All of it, whether it's a bubble, whether it's a sphere, whether it's whatever it might be, has clear architectonic qualities, geometries, interests. And I would think if you even start to bring in Wes Jones's kind of typical argument that architecture always in excess of engineering and all the requirements, it seems, yes, all of this is architecture. It's just you have to also accept that architecture is technological, it is engineered, and these are viable studies and actually extremely prevalent in all building practices and all forms and all architecture. So I just find it so fascinating that someone would try to argue that this is not a highly riven topical discourse that you put together is sort of interesting. And now no one would ever say that, right? I mean, how could you?
Maybe I did not, you know what, like something that I didn't do, and I now that I'm thinking of it, when I was analyzing all the case studies in the book, and you can read through some of them, my focus was not on the aesthetics of environmental expressionism, even though I knew that this was a very big part of a lot of projects. So I wasn't trying to make arguments on how machines were used, overused as kind of tools of expression, how they were set up, although in some case, but although I knew that there was a long legacy of that, not only in the Pompidou, but even scientists, the way that they represented their machines from the 19th century. I was reading an experiment on a closed system, and one of the scientists said that it has to look complex technically so that it can sell the idea that this will work. So the visualization of the complexity of the way a system would work was very much part of that. But I chose to put that a little bit aside. So I'm not trying to justify that. I think it is the way we put machinery together is an architectural problem, and it is part of architectural legacy. You rightly mentioned the work of Wes Jones and the Pompidou, and environmental expressionism is a huge topic, but it's not the topic that I chose deliberately to analyze in this field of work. I was mostly interested in the kind of idealization of circularity, in the idea of a building of form replaced by performance, creating a new kind of ethos of a positive ethos of newly formed functionalism in environmental performance. So that was where the kind of crux of the critique was focused on.
Do we have another question, maybe from students in the gallery? I'm sure you must have something to ponder. If not, also, I guess, I don't know if Menace wants another question here. I took him out. Anybody else out there? Attendees have something? Because I can bring up more. I just want to give you all a chance.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so hi, thanks for the lecture. I really appreciate it in our closed system time right now, I guess. But I was just wondering about certain ideas about utopia. I know you briefly mentioned it, and ideas like biosphere and Epcot like clearly relate to it. But your lecture made it very clear to me that not all closed worlds are utopias. But I'm just wondering, are all utopias closed worlds? Is that like a requirement, do you think, like for like a perfect system or society?
Well, if you would ask my colleague and mentor Tony Vidler if there is such a thing as a utopia, he would say there is no such thing, and that the etymology of utopia negates the existence of utopia. So so he would say that utopia is an impalpable concept inherently, that it doesn't exist and it can never exist, and it's described as something that can never be materialized, something that can never happen. Now, you're asking whether all of these suggestions are closed systems. And tentatively, I would say that if you think of Thomas More's case, which is, let's say, the first instantiation of utopia, it's an island, right? A lot of utopias are replications or extractions of world where things are re-regulated inside something. Now, whether that's a kind of fully closed world, materially, environmentally, in terms of how people operate, they're just different degrees of closure, right? And in the book, I didn't have one type of, not everything was as sealed, let's say, as Biosphere 2. Biosphere 2 was sealed in terms of air, it generated everything inside, but other projects took electricity from outside and they were just about air. So there's a whole taxonomy on different degrees of closure. Like in that matter, I would say that utopia does restructure something from scratch. Like the idea of understanding a utopic world necessitates a kind of erasure of what we know as a canonical environment and a restructuring. So it is a closed world in many ways, but how close that is materially, physically, really depends on the story each time.
So I might ask you if you gave an auto rank / Freudian read, and you did mention hysteria in some ways, or anxiety or fear. And I'm starting to wonder, is that utopian fantasy often associated with, I suppose, anxiety of being around other people and the desire to be asocial, or, as you said, autonomous? Or there's something curious about that interest embedded in some of these projects, in the desire to separate oneself from others.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that, to be honest. If you think of, Freud thought of hysteria very spatially. That's why I used his definition. Like he would think that he would think of a body as not as a porous, let's say, he would think of the skin, of the perimeter of the body, the borders, not as something porous, but of, whether a kind of condition is inside someone's mind, it materializes in anomalous combinations and produces hysteria from the inside. So, that's a very rough and maybe brutal definition of what he called the internal modification of the nervous system. But if you read through the text, there's something very spatial about the way that he understands flows in the body in the internal modification. Now, in terms of isolation and of the will to isolate, I think that was, it's part of human nature, right? It's an existential desire. All of these representations of think of representations of the sublime, right? Of, the famous painting of the sublime, of the traveler, of the wanderer looking on his own, a kind of vast land, or of when we have science fiction imaginaries of a Martian in a vast land where there's nothing except for a body in space. Like, all this is a narrative of a kind of uncontrollable, like, blank space that is somehow a tapped territory, and that's something that becomes an existential desire. And there is a little bit of that fantasy in isolation.
And so I'm reading it, though, as being incredibly controlled. So it's a
Right.
desire to control one's environment. Of course, I'm coming from a Kieslerian point of view, which I'm sure is in your book, right? Kiesler, of course, created varied internalized spaces. He never really thought about the outside. He always thought about the inside. Even the Endless House never showed an outside, you know, except the physical outside, but no looking out into the world. And that has a lot of those sort of I would call them simplistic Freudian reads that would argue that, you know, that intrauterine discourse, basically the fear and desire to get back into, you know, the womb kind of thing. But and also digestion too. It's also an intrauterine discussion, but it's also a digestion thing because it's also associated with the intestines. So I don't know, there's something there. I just, in the way in which this is sort of playing out in our contemporary world, we started our conversation talking about introverts and extroverts. And I don't know.
Right.
Some people are very comfortable. Some people are very uncomfortable right now. I don't know. I mean, are people getting comfortable? Are you guys adjusting to this introverted existence with these weird media modes of behavior? This goes to the students and audience. You have to speak. I guess that's a non-speak.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
in my experience / opinion, it hasn't really been too bad of a shift, honestly. Like, I personally list myself as like an introvert. Like, I definitely enjoy like social times and whatnot. And even like things like this, like being online all the time, is even like too much for me. Like, I'd honestly be cool if it was just like I do my thing. You know, when I'm outside for like essential business, I see other people. I don't gotta get near them. I can avoid like stranger conversations, which tend to happen a lot in the world. So like, it's been nice just like to steer clear and stay in my own bubble, my personal quarantine zone. I don't know though.
It is, at least for me, I agree with you, Zane. I think it's been kind of an interesting transition where our sources of interaction or knowledge, or in this instance, like a lecture, for example, I mean, it's interesting that we only seek that through plugging in, you know, to the internet, and otherwise we would be unplugged. So when you go to school, you'd be plugged in, and then once you're done, you're more or less unplugging yourself from inputs from others outside of your internal home. So I think that's been really interesting. It's kind of tough also to shift back and forth between home life and then plugging back in, but that's me personally.
Stephen, you should read Slavoj Zizek's Survival Guide to Coronavirus.
Okay.
You will like it. His argument, as expected, was very controversial. He was saying that introverts are actually the most terrified out of this situation, not the ones that are feeling more at home and comfortable. And why did he say that? He said that I'm an introvert and I would choose to stay at when I travel, I would choose to stay in the hotel room and read something nice and like you know, and I could self identify with that a little bit. Like, I like also to, when I travel, to spend some time in the hotel room and the pleasures of being with myself. But he was saying that there's a kind of double negation in that. The fact that you don't have the choice to negate that, or that the whole world is doing what you were choosing to do, makes you experience it as a spectral fantasy. And so the whole world is doing what you were doing before, so you're not really experiencing the change. You're trying to identify with a kind of larger collective. So I mean, that's his argument. Read it. He has an interesting joke, an interesting anecdote. He says, waiter, can I have a coffee without cream, please? He's like, oh, I'm sorry, we only have a coffee without milk. Which is the same thing, but the negation is a different typology. of
Yeah,
negation.
I might ask a question from what you just said, though. It seems to me it's
Well,
not
ask
related.
Zizek.
Yeah, but I like what you were saying. It's not so much about whether you're an introvert or extrovert, but also maybe motivation. So there seems to be a pleasure in what he seems to be describing in sort of other territory, and that he can position himself against others and feel strength and character within that. And then it's ripped away from him when his otherness is entirely the same as
Yes,
everybody else. And that's a different kind
exactly.
of discussion, which is an interesting one too, right? I mean, you find that in lots of that kind of political gendered discussions too. Interesting.
Yeah, I like your explanation. When your otherness is ripped away, it creates a lot of existential issues.
Yeah, because a lot of your desire is to be other, and to lose that and to be same is incredibly problematic and interesting and questioning. So I don't know. Does anyone else have another question for Lydia? We didn't really, yeah, there we go. Here comes Sam. Sam wants to speak, so I'm going to let him talk.
Okay.
Sam, you're on.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Cool. So I really like the thinking that was going on too with like the relevancy of coronavirus. And so I was thinking of like extending it out into the future too, especially of like looking at planet Earth as a closed system that's like slowly becoming more and more open. How do you see architecture kind of expanding into that like formerly engineering and math field of like space navigation, but that's now a very different new open system basically that Earth's now a part of?
Well, the discussion of the Earth on whether it is a closed or an open system is a very long one, and it's definitely been a very vibrant one throughout the 20th century. There are books written about it. There's scientific theories about it, about the Gaia, about the planetary evolution, and the kind of consensus, let's say canonical, is that materially the Earth is a closed system, but energetically it's an open system because it dissipates energy to outer space and so forth. Now, I think that the current situation that we're experiencing is a very challenging one because of the fact that it's challenging borders and territoriality. And I think that, I don't know if that's related to the kind of planetary imagery of the Earth as a closed or open system, but it's definitely showing that there is no displacement of something to another territory, right? So what I was showing to you with a train that takes the shit from New York and takes it to Alabama, which is a kind of political decision to export poo from a privileged city to a kind of less privileged city. That's something that cannot happen right now. The dislocation is something that we can't just like take coronavirus to Antarctica and keep it there. And so that's what is very interesting to see, that displacement is no longer an option. And the other really interesting thing is to see how people are awakened to the materiality of climate change, kind of realities that were completely in a level of abstraction. So I think that's something that we're going to have to wrap our heads around in the years to come. And a lot of people have been warning about this. Like, I've been reading this really great book that I'm going to recommend that you all read. It's very small. It's called Down to Earth. It's by Bruno Latour. I just read it a few days ago. And he was trying to, really fathom with the phenomenon of climate change denial, and to connect it with deregulation and inequalities. And he was saying that climate is a material condition, and at some point there's going to be a landing process. That's how he calls it, a landing process. And it is very much not so much what is happening right now. I don't see it as a kind of discourse of closed versus open worlds, as much as a landing process of the kind of negotiating of borders, national borders, borders of the house, how spatial relationships are formed. And I think that in the larger scale, that's going to impact very gravely the way that we understand our discipline, but also space and how we operate as architects.
That was really a good place. Maybe to end this, unless I have someone who's in absolute need of a question. That was fantastic, Lydia.
Aw.
Seriously, it was super fun. So happy we had this opportunity and that you were able to do it. Not happy that the world is the way it is, but you know, makes.
Well, we will meet at some point, right?
Oh yeah, eventually they'll figure out a way. Even if we all have to wear masks, it's all fine. Anyway, so thank you to our guest Lydia. Thank you so much, Lydia.
Thank you guys. Thank you for having me. Such a stimulating conversation and amazing thing to see all of you on the screen in this exhibition. I loved it.
Super fun being in the exhibition too.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Lydia. And thank you to all the attendees who are out there.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, and we'll have Paul Lewis from LTL next week, same time.
All right.
Cool.
Bye, guys.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful night. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.